I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Dinner.
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
This is Andrew Wittstadt, and you were listening to Heavy Bored. And we're recording this on May 14th, 2025. My guest today is Ron Richard. Ron is a medical device consultant with over 35 years of experience in the industry. He's launched over 40 products in his career, and he's the owner of 17 patents in the medical device industry. And on top of that, he runs his own consulting firm. Ron sits on the board of several organizations and businesses. And on top of all that, listeners, Ron is also a writer. His first book, Someday is Today, came out in 2021, a nonfiction book that might be categorized in the business and marketing sections. The book details the path for other entrepreneurs in a step-by-step process. But Ron has made the move into fiction with his debut novel, The Zenith Project, published January of this year, in which a sleep experiment goes wrong in a science fiction thriller style story. And it's a pleasure to welcome him onto Heavy Board today. Ron Richards, thank you so much for coming on Heavy Board.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for the invite. Appreciate it.
We like to start this off with our first question to writers is, what was your childhood like? Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? How did these early years start to form Ron?
Oh gosh, my dad was in the Air Force, and I was born in Denver, where we lived for about 6 weeks. And then my dad was stationed at a different Air Force base. So we moved around. I'd say we lived on 15 different bases from the time I was born till probably I was 7 or 8 years old. Finally, my dad got out of the Air Force, and the moves were less frequent. And so I did get to see a lot of the United States and got to grow up and make friends, but sometimes only for 6 months. And then we were loading the station wagon up and moving on. But
did you have to do any international stuff with your father in the military like that? Any moves?
No, my dad was stationed in South Korea during the war. And so he would come home probably for a few weeks over a period of a couple of years.
Okay.
So,
but you never had to move out there. Yeah. It was just.
No, we never, I think he had a chance to move to Okinawa, and we never did it. But I've traveled a lot all over the world for my work and my job, and I've lived in a lot of really awesome countries while I've been doing projects.
That's fantastic. What did your mother do?
Well, I have 5 brothers and sisters, so my mom was pretty busy just raising kids.
Yeah.
And,
are you the oldest, youngest, middle child? Where do you fall?
I'm the oldest.
The oldest. Okay, so all the responsibilities on you then, Ron, your whole life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looking out for siblings and stuff.
Yeah,
and you said, so was it mostly like a middle class kind of suburban upbringing, or you said you were moving around so much it was varied? Or I mean,
yeah, we probably were in the lower percentile income family, not well off at all. Living on a salary from the military was not all that great. So once my dad got out of the military, though, he took a job with several different aircraft manufacturing companies and started making a little bit more money. But I don't think my dad bought his first home until I was probably 14 years old.
That's interesting too, in terms of, and you said he was in the Korean War with my grandfather was a Air Force veteran in the Korean War there. And, he would talk about a little bit, he wasn't a career guy, so he didn't stay in there much longer past, the draft term or whatever. But it's always interesting, that forgotten war, as they call it, the Korean War, and all the veterans that were a little too young for World War II, but then a little too old for Vietnam, and kind of get kind of lost in between those two big wars. Yeah, it's interesting. It's going to come up. It's a theme on the podcast, kind of the the wars that kind of are in our culture, particularly World War II and stuff. The last couple episodes, we've had some guests that were just talking about it. It's come up, so I just that's interesting, very interesting. Yeah, yeah. And the next question we like to go is when did reading and writing come into your life? Was that something you always did? Were you young? Is it something you came to later in life? When did reading and writing kind of come into your life?
Probably, I'd say I've always liked to read. And in fact, I remember we had a book reading contest when I was in third grade, and I won the contest. I think I read 30 or 40 books that year in school, and loved the older style books, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and stories about Greek mythology. Uh, really fascinated with outer space, anything that had to do with the moon and lunar landing type things. Kind of always had an interest in reading a wide variety of things, and I kind of have the same taste in music too. I like everything from jazz to blues.
Yeah, we love that on this podcast. Yeah, eclectic tastes that kind of go all over the place too. That's the
Mhm.
real strike of you appreciate it all, you appreciate all the styles, all the different nuances. It's fantastic. And we always ask that too, because sometimes, like especially people go through phases. I guess it's hard for maybe some of our younger listeners to understand that reading was just something you did until very recently, right? Like very recently, like whenever with younger people, like, oh, I struggle to read this 300-page book. I was like, okay, well, most of the time that was just what you did in school. Every week you had a new book to read. Not anymore, not anymore. So it's always interesting when that comes in. And going off of that, we like to ask what were some of the first writers you were enamored with, or who are your go-to kind of, you'd call inspirations or idols in the literary world, the world of letters and all that?
I had I can't remember the author, but the person who wrote all the Narnia
Oh,
books,
yes, C.S. Lewis. Yeah.
C.S. Lewis, and I liked the Screw Tape Letters. He wrote that, and so I became kind of a big fan of his.
Oh, yeah.
And then a lot of the stuff related to Lord of the Rings.
Oh, yeah.
And what kind of influenced my last book was reading things that were done by Robin Cook, kind of medical murder mysteries. And so my new book is kind of in that same vein or same style in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to get to Cook too. I have a specific questions about it. One, we love Cook on this podcast. And yeah, when I was looking up to this, you'd mentioned Robin Cook was a big, big, big idol of yours, and we love Crichton. We love these kind of these
Yeah.
big sci-fi guys in that the heyday of publishing. Really, when these guys were just cranking out books they were so good. They were
Mhm.
so good too, and they were just cranking them out. And it was like, oh my god.
Yeah, Elmore James or
Uh,
Philip K. Dick is
yeah, 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 yeah.
other ones that I really enjoy reading a lot of their material.
Yeah, yeah. And when you started with the C.S. Lewis, was that when you were younger, like a kid, kind of getting
Yeah.
into it? Yeah. And then
Hmm.
evolving into like the kind of the sci-fi stuff with a little more sexual, a little more violent, with Crichton
Hmm.
and Cook. And yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. We love that kind of stuff here. And going a little bit away from book writing here, I want to talk about your career too. Like in the medical device industry, I think most listeners out there have no idea what that even is. How did you get started in the world of medical devices? Is that something you set out to do? Did you just fall into it? How did you get started in the medical device industry?
In college, I took a lot of pre-med courses. I wanted to be a doctor, and I had a friend that worked at a hospital while I was going to college. Told me there were some openings, and I could apply for a job, and I took a position actually working in surgeries in OR tech. And then from there, uh, got into respiratory therapy, and I ended my career as a paramedic working in emergency medicine. So over a period of about 8 years, I evolved from the surgical suite to doing critical care with respiratory care and then emergency medicine. But I never went to medical school. I basically um, towards the end of my career, I got to be friends with a lot of sales reps that were coming in and calling on the hospital where I worked. And I became interested in sales and marketing. And got a job in sales and started working for manufacturers selling medical equipment to hospitals, and had a great career doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I'm interesting how that happens. Everybody's life, kind of how you end up in these situations, and kind of like sometimes things fall into your lap. Other times, you have to grind for decades to get there. It
Mhm.
really, when you're at that position, you do start to see all the little things, like the little mismanagement problems, or the little, red tape that's like making something bad, or not as good patient, or hurting the patient care in some way. And so now he's become more interested in getting a position where he can make a difference in that way. Yeah, because it's frustrating. Yeah, when you're the paramedic and your hands are tied by some type of red tape and all of that. And yeah, that's interesting. And then medical devices. That again, it's one of those things that it's so important, but so few people even know what it is. Like that, there's this whole industry about the devices, and we hear about the bad ones. We hear about the lawsuits over whatever, that mesh or something that was used in like implants or something, or
Mhm.
heart stents. That gets sued and everyone has to stop using it. But we don't hear about all the success stories where like a new device is invented and it's saving lives every day, because it's not sexy and cool and all that. It's just this little tiny piece of plastic or like a little valve in the heart that's
Mhm.
changes everybody's life and the whole trajectory of the world. I was thinking about like you inventing devices, like in your kind of entrepreneurial part of your life, like what is your process like for inventing a new device? And I guess I'm asking kind of, most people think this is like a mad scientist, like in a lab style stuff, but like, how does it actually work for you in terms of like when you were inventing devices? Like how did it start with a spark? Was it something you saw and then started thinking, working the problem through? How does that come about? Or were you just literally, mad scientist in a lab tinkering? Like, how did you start getting into inventing devices and stuff like that?
I was really, to be honest, Andrew, so lucky with my first invention. It was a simple communication board that we used with patients on ventilators. And when you're on a ventilator, you're intubated and they put a tube into your airway and you immediately lose the ability to speak, which we take for granted. Uh, Once you lose that ability, patients get very anxious. Uh, they're afraid. They're trying to just get simple things that they can talk to someone and easily achieve that. And now all of a sudden, the communication is lost or gone. And so I was able to see this firsthand through being a respiratory therapist, and talked to my supervisor, who then talked to my medical director about my idea of developing a simple communication board that could be used at the bedside with a patient so that they could get easily the most common things that they would want. I need a drink. I'm in pain. I would like to talk to the doctor. I need a nurse. And so over a period of 6 months, the hospital allowed me to do a research project with people that were on ventilators. And if they survived and they wanted to be interviewed, I could interview them post extubation after they were recovering. And we would talk about what were the most common things that you wanted or you wanted to communicate to people. And I took those notes down and I interviewed, I don't know, probably 50 patients over a period of a few months. Because I worked in a teaching hospital and we had at least close to 100 ventilators. So any given day, there were many, many people on ventilators throughout the hospital. So after gathering that data and information, I started to construct the prototypes and started testing them on patients in the ICU. And the nurses started noticing it. And uh, the reward to the patient and to the staff was better communication, improved outcomes. Patients were less frustrated, less anxious, and so were the family members when they would come to visit, because there was also an alphabet on the bottom of the board that they could actually spell out words if what they were trying to say wasn't on there. Anyway, that led to the hospital approving that I could publish a paper about the project. And after that, I was contacted by a medical manufacturing company who wanted to license and sell the product uh, in the United States and then eventually globally. Well, over a period of about 5 years, they sold over 100,000 of these communication boards. And I was fortunate enough again to where the hospital didn't want a royalty. They didn't want anything from it. They were glad and happy that, it met a need and it had been developed. And around that same time when I signed that deal, I actually transitioned out of the hospital, and that's when I got into sales. So my life has been I'd say 80% luck, 20% thinking through things and the logic applied to that. But a lot of it's been meeting the right people at the right time who wanted to take the trouble or effort to mentor me. And I've always been a good listener and I think pretty humble. And generally, that got me on a stepping stone, kind of a pathway to going from working in a hospital with the things that I was doing there to eventually working for Fortune 500 companies and becoming CEO and managing millions of dollars in budgets for projects and product development. So a lot of fast forward, the products that I developed throughout my career were based on my firsthand experience working with patients. And one of the things that I've always impressed on companies where I've worked, and even with my consulting business, is build products that are patient-centric, build products that meet the needs of a patient first and foremost, and don't worry about the money. If it's a good product, you'll get rewarded monetarily later on down the road. But essentially, if you put the patient's needs first and do a lot of ground up prep work, interviews like I did, talk to patients, actually see how the products are used and how they work. And that's what my first book was about, Someday is Today. It's really taking a framework of building a product from the ground up with the patient being the center of this kind of matrix. And if you do that and you follow those steps, you'll be more successful than just kind of the mad scientist route.
Right. Yeah. Like that's, and I was looking up some of your patents too, when you had, a lot of them were CPAP, at least more recent years, kind of CPAP adaptions or like improvements, right? Like little, that's always interesting too. My father's in medicine. He was a surgeon in my hometown for, 35 years. He's retired now, but he would always talk about that, with, somebody would come up with a new little piece of metal or something that just helps the surgeries work better, and it just revolutionizes the game. So it's always interesting to just one little thing, like, oh, this machine works great, but then one little thing, one little idea comes into somebody's head, or an example, your head, and then you're like, oh, well, we could improve this, and I'm thinking of like the CPAPs now that they're coming out. You don't even have to put anything on your face. Some of these new ones that they're coming out with, that's what else do you call it? I mean, incredible technological breakthrough. I mean, like, incredible. And it's just interesting. Yeah, I was so excited to have you on to talk about that. You're one of the guys that innovated the CPAP machine several times throughout your career.
Yeah,
Yeah, please. What got you into that?
No, I was going to say the lecture I did at Stanford back in 2020 really was the springboard for the book, because my audience was doctors and clinicians. And I was invited there from the dean of the business school. He'd heard about my success in the area of sleep. And I went up to the sleep lab, and they gave me a tour, and they had kind of a museum there. And they introduced me and they showed me the museum of all the different CPAP machines from the 1980s till fairly current. And the guy turned to me and he looked all the people in the department. He goes, and this guy developed 50% of what you see in the museum. Right. And it was like very, very humbling. But yeah, machines were a lot bigger. They were really noisy. And the mask, the initial masks that you put on your face, you had to use cosmetic glue to actually stick them on your face and then strap it down. And people would wake up with sores on their faces. And it was really quite terrible. But when I worked in the hospital in the 70s, the only treatment really for people that had sleep apnea was to give them a tracheostomy so they could breathe through their bypass their upper airway and basically breathe through their throat or their neck. So you fast forward now, the machines are, a third the size. They're very quiet. You can't hear them running. Like you said, the masks are almost invisible or really not there.
Yeah, that's incredible too. I mean, it's one of those things. I feel like sleep apnea is one of those chronic things that sneaks up on almost everyone. And people hear about it with like athletes or bodybuilders and people that have a lot of weight. And I guess maybe the obesity epidemic in a country and stuff like that is an issue. People that just have, more mass on their body than you should, whatever that is, whether you're, taking steroids to lift in bodybuilding or you're just, obese or whatever it is. It's like the number one cause of like people having issues in their life, fatigue. It causes other issues and like heart problems, all of that. If you're not sleeping properly, you can't breathe while you're sleeping.
Mhm.
So, I mean, really, I mean, it's just incredible. I was like, man, this guy, yeah, like this guy coming on my show and pretty much invented the modern day CPAP that everybody's using, or at least contributed, to improving that. And that's because I mean, it is interesting. So, I mean, let's get to your first book then. Yeah, because I wanted to ask, like, so what inspired you to write that first book about your experiences in the medical industry? You said it was that conference that kind of sparked it, giving
Mhm.
presentation, and obviously your illustrious career in this field. Kind of,
Yeah, it was seeing firsthand a group of clinicians and physicians who had the time to show up and listen to what I had to say in terms of, and my main emphasis was you sitting in the audience have firsthand experience like I did, and you see problems every day that you encounter with the products you're using. Just by making little fine-tuned changes and evolving the current technology, you could come up with a new invention and have a side gig. You could license it to a medical manufacturer. You could start up your own medical company. Some doctors, clinicians have chosen that path too, or you could do consulting. But there's lots of opportunities because you're at the coal face of really what's going on and what's important in medicine. You're doing this on a daily basis. You're hands on with this stuff. It's not engineers making things in an ivory tower that make great inventions. It's people like you that can talk to engineers and communicate clearly to them. What if we did this? What if we changed this product around a little bit, or we fine-tuned it and we made it easier to use? We improved outcomes, made the patients happier, and that's where kind of the whole framework of the book started. It was based on just a short conversation I actually had with a doctor after the talk was over. And he goes, I've got all these great ideas, but they're stuck in my coffee cup on my desk. And how do I get them out? How do I get those ideas out of my coffee cup? And I said, you can't be afraid to try something different. You can't be afraid, and don't hesitate, because I don't ever want to see you in 5 years go, I had this great idea, but I didn't take action. I didn't take the first step. And that was just draw it on a piece of paper, get started with thinking through it. I mean, that's kind of the process I show people in book, because doctors and clinicians don't go to school to be entrepreneurs.
right. Same with
Um,
writers. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
writers too. And so after that, that's when I thought, you know what, I've got a lot of experience. I hope I can take my experiences and encourage people like doctors and clinicians to get more engaged and involved with product development and inventions.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because the reason I was asking so much about the invention process and how you got started with it and what you like, because I feel like, the Edison and image and stuff is just people have this image from like turn of the century with this like laboratory full of worker bees where they're like pushing them to innovate a product, or even you thinking of like the R&D product development for big companies like Johnson and Johnson or whatever, right? Where they literally have like a lab full of, inventors, engineers, and now computer programmers at this point too. And they're like tasked with, oh, improve this. It's always interesting because you kind of see like the biggest inventions come from just one guy, like Ron, listeners, seeing stuff every day and then kind of like, oh, what if we did this? Like what if we changed it a little bit? And that tends to lead to an even bigger innovation than any of these, hundreds of billions in R&D departments for all of these kind of medical companies, and even, yeah, everyday household products like Johnson and Johnson skincare and all of that. It's just interesting how that happens. I wonder, what do you think of that in terms of, do you think you get better results from like innovation on your own, or in like a lab setting like you would in some of these big companies that are meant to design products?
That's a good question, because lately I've been working with a lot of startups, and they are teams of 4 or 5 people, but it always starts with one or two.
Right.
get the idea, and then they have to bring in contractors, engineers, software programmers, things like that. And the latest evolution of all this is now we're starting to apply some forms of AI to help improve the workflow process, not so much the invention or the inventing part of it, but there's a lot of forms and things you have to fill out constantly when you're dealing with a new product in a new, a startup in particular. All that being said, if you're working for Johnson and Johnson or Medtronic or somebody, they have those already, the rigor of everything set up and a process defined, and they've done it so many times that they pretty much it's very formulaic, and there's not much deviation from the formula of how a Medtronic or a Johnson and Johnson does product development and marketing and sales. So, the big thing I always tell people, you've got a great idea. It looks like it's an evolution of something that's already a predicate. And when I talk about predicates, that's a big thing in the book. When I hear people say I've got a revolutionary idea versus evolutionary idea, I get a red flag right away going, if it's revolutionary, it's going to cost a lot of money to get to market. You won't have a predicate. You're not going to be able to probably get through the FDA. And that's going to take a lot of time and clinical studies and money that you're going to burn through trying to create this revolutionary idea or product. So I always like evolutionary type things that have a predicate so that you can, refer to that when we're doing your 510K filings and your FDA work. That helps speed things up and kind of workflow that through the whole process, because we're in a very regulated environment in the medical industry.
That's interesting too, because I think, that's when you're starting to something like a startup, even like if you're doing medical side, the tech side of medicine and stuff like that, you get this idea and you're like, oh, this would change the game forever. But then how does innovation actually happen? Well, one small step at a time, usually, like you're saying, where actually the reality is, you got to go through all this stuff. And I remember, just the application for FDA approval and all of this stuff is going to cost you millions and the fees and lawyers and everything that you have to pay. Yeah, it's like one small step at a time, and then the evolution snowballs, the innovation, the game changing thing that you were trying to go for originally kind of snowballs. So I like that too. I think the same thing happens with writing. Like when you're writing on something, you have this big idea, and you're like, oh, this is going to be a great book or a great poem or whatever, and then the process of it is one small step at a time. One little tiny word at a time, paragraph at a time, and then you get the big picture eventually. But you kind of get over, I think what stops a lot of people from putting stuff into books is they get the great idea for a book, but then the long, arduous process of one step at a time kind of discourages them or slows them down. So it's just a great attitude, I think, to have through creative fields. And I want to talk to you about creativity and kind of using invention or innovation in fiction writing in your entrepreneurial work. How do you use creativity? Where do you seek inspiration, or what do you find works best for you when you're trying to be creative and develop kind of creative habits? How much of that have you been able to transfer from your kind of successful career in medical devices to writing fiction and nonfiction, writing books essentially?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question, because I'm a musician too, and I've written a lot of songs, and I've published a lot of music that's on iTunes and Spotify and whatnot.
We'll
The
link it
same,
below. I didn't know that. Yeah, we'll link it
yeah.
below, please.
So the same formula that I use to write songs, it just so happens those frameworks are in place to do product development, and it also applies to writing a book. So I'll give you an example. When I first started working on my first book, I just used the same approach that I did for writing songs and doing product development. I created a framework for the book, and that started with titles for the chapters. And then below that was two or three sentences. What's this chapter going to be about? And then from there started to let the ideas percolate and just start writing about a topic for each chapter, and then go through the editing process. And I self-published both my books too, by the way. And I
Yeah.
did the same thing with music. But even with product development and inventions, writing a book, writing songs, I think everybody gets writer's block at some point. You hit a wall and you just you have to figure out something that's going to spark or stimulate the thinking process or the creativity part of your brain to get through these obstacles. And sometimes you have to be patient. There's been times when I thought I was going to give up on something, and I what I tell people is just put it down for a while, and if it's worth the time and effort, it'll repercolate in your little file cabinet system in your brain, and all of a sudden you'll go, "That's it." Pull
Right.
it back out, and you start working on it wherever you stopped, restart the project. With the goal in mind, at some point you're going to want to finish it. You can't have feature creep and everything, otherwise you don't get anything done.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that too. And that's something that's a theme on the podcast too. We always like to ask because I think time and distance, when you separate yourself a little bit, you get too inside your own head, you get too excited, you have this new idea, whether that's, doing some creative fiction work or poetry work, listeners, or like in Ron's case, uh, inventing a new product or a new adapter for something that improves everyone's life and health. It's you kind of you can get stuck by being too obsessed with the outcome, and you kind of get stuck in your own head, and just a little time and distance, just it's a cliche, right? Time heals all things. Well,
Mhm.
it's kind of true for creativity too. It kind of
Yeah.
heals that, whatever creates that bridge that you're missing, that you need for like a couple ideas in your head to come together. It's kind of strange how that works. Yeah, very interesting with that
We
creativity.
were
Yeah.
talking earlier too about books that I've read, and I like one of them was written by Arnold Palmer. And I love to play golf. It's such an interesting game, but there's a quote in there: "The road to success is always under construction."
Right.
And that's what Arnold Palmer's view of life was. And that you talk about a guy who just made a huge impact on charities and such a nice person and a great athlete. Arnold Palmer was, right up there with the best of them. But that's the way I look at life too, is that, it's always under construction. Don't don't give up, keep working hard. Anything that's worth, having is you got to work hard for it. It's and you got to have, like I said earlier, luck. A
Yeah.
lot of things that I've invented and things I've done. I've been pretty lucky to be around the right people at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That kind of collaboration. And it's
Mhm.
interesting for writers too, because I think writing is a solo act. You're doing it alone, in a room by yourself or whatever. And then you're kind of bringing it to the world. But you still kind of need collaboration in a creative process, editors and kind of, designers and things like that. If you don't know how to do that yourself, of course. But
Mhm.
yeah, that's great. Golf, though. Yeah, Arnold Palmer. I like that you brought it up because we love American cultural icons on this on this podcast, and Arnold Palmer is definitely one of many athletes that are bigger than life. I love the romanticism, the bigger than life figures, the Michael Jordans, the Babe Ruths, these people that Tiger Woods even is up there. He's not dead yet, but when he does, I think maybe his legacy was ruined. I don't know. We don't have to get into that, but it's interesting with that. I mean, Arnold Palmer, we have a drink named after this guy. Like, and it's not like he even invented the drink. It's just like it was just his favorite, and we just started calling it that. Like, it's I love that. I love how these little things happen, and you never know how they're going to happen, but they do. And then he becomes this huge figure. What got you into golf? Was it your career in sales and stuff? I know it's kind of an older school thing. I don't know if people even still do this in sales, but oh, you have to make this pitch on the golf course. If you're doing something like that, so you have to learn how to play golf to be in sales. Is that like something from the 60s, 70s, or is it just like something you've always done and got into? How did you get into golf? What
It was purely by accident, and I
Yeah.
just got invited to play by a friend of mine who, of all things, I was playing tennis with, and he said, "Well, have you ever played golf?" I go, "No, I don't know anything about it." He goes, "Well, I got an exercise club. Why don't we go out and hit it around a little bit because you're a good tennis player. It's just eye hand contact." So I got started playing in my late 20s, and I still just love to play. I try to get out once a week, just to be
Yeah.
outside, and be in the outdoors, and then chase after the white golf ball down the fairway.
Yeah, yeah. That's always great too. Golf, it's a great sport. Yeah, it's a great. I grew up. I didn't get very serious about it, but I did start playing it young. My brother was always better than me at it, so he was more serious and would get lessons and stuff and be in like junior tournaments and things. But and then yeah, just I don't know, it's always interesting. My grandfather was big into golf, so he would take us out, as like an outing or something when he was retired. He was just golfing every day, getting 9 holes in or whatever, in the
Mhm.
morning and going about your day. He would take us, and that was always a lot of fun. But yeah, golf is one of those things where you can do it quickly or you can leisurely take hours, and kind of relax.
Mhm.
It's one of those sports that combines relaxation and frustration probably more than any other. I
Mhm.
don't know. I mean, because you can just relax and drive the cart to the next hole, and then you slice it to the right, and then you're frustrated. It's great.
You
Yeah.
can have one good shot, and then the next shot can be just terrible. It's an most unforgiving game or sport I've ever played.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's no hiding either that bright white ball. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Everybody
But no,
sees.
I did get started playing to be engaged with business
Right.
discussions, and it is a good, unless you overdo it. You kind of learn the etiquette of don't talk too much about business while you're on the course. But on the 19th hole, when you have a libation or two, then we start to get it more into the business discussions than we do on the course.
Yeah, when I was right out of college, I got a job working at a cigar shop in Baltimore, where I'm from, and there were a lot of older guys that worked there part time, and one of the guys was a golf pro at one of the local courses. And I remember asking him, like, how do you end up being a golf pro at a golf course like this, giving lessons and stuff? And he's like, honestly, this guy, he worked at like grocery stores for like 20 years, eventually worked his way up from cashier to management and stuff for a big grocery chain. Did that 25 years, retired, got into golf, and then all of a sudden he started just, getting good enough practicing to be like, the pro on staff or whatever at at the local course. And then would
Awesome.
work at the cigar shop with people like me to get discounts and just pass the time, I guess, when he's not on the course. So
Sounds like a good life.
yeah, yeah, he was an interesting guy. He was an interesting guy, yeah. But that's always interesting too. Yeah, cigars and golf. That's always that's one of my hobby horses. Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm always interested. Okay, I wanted to talk about dreams versus reality. And this is kind of about your first book still, like kind of, you know, how does one make their dream a reality like you did? This is kind of the topic of the book, of your first book, at least. How, how do you do it? How do you recommend people do it? Because everybody's always, oh, I want, my dream is to do this. I want to chase my dream. You're kind of giving people a blueprint, like how to turn that idea into a reality. How did you do that? How did you do that? How do you recommend people do it? Because I think it's even beyond the medical device. I think in creativity, I think this applies to your novel writing, your book writing, all of that.
Yeah, I'd have to say it started probably kind of associated or coupled with having to move around and adapt to a lot of different places and do it fairly quickly. So, in order to be accepted in the school or the community wherever I was at, I always tried to excel and be the best at, playing baseball or whatever sports were in the area and try to make friends through that. And that's kind of when I also got my first start in music. I got accepted and started touring with the Texas Boys Choir, doing Broadway musicals when I was 9 and 10 years old. And so early on, I learned that if you don't raise your hand and step forward and take a chance, even though sometimes you may fail, uh, you won't challenge yourself enough to where you're gonna move ahead in life. And so one of the common themes, based on not being afraid, was to take calculated risks, but also be able to raise your hand and move forward with trying something different, something new, and accepting those challenges to kind of keep you sharp.
Yeah. You mentioned this. I know it was just in passing, the boys choir. Were you singing it from a young age in choirs like
Yes.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. That was my foundation for getting into music. And now I play harmonica, flute, saxophone, percussion, and I play right now I'm touring with a blues band.
Oh, okay. Great. Great. Yeah. I did that too. I just had my first kid, and I'm obsessed with when she's old enough teaching her how to sing. And I'm just like, it's something that I think most people, I was in Maryland Children's Chorus growing up and stuff, and I did it through high school. I was in the chorus, like and all of that. And I get great pleasure out of it. Like, I think it's a lot of fun to sing, especially when you're in a group of 20, 30, 50 people, even
Yeah.
less,
Hmm.
that when you're all hitting those notes together, like it really does put that chill over your body. Like, we're
Hmm.
creating something. It's an energy force that's being created. All these
Powerful,
voices. Yeah.
very powerful.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Yeah. So I love that you have that little background neat detail there too. That's fantastic. And I like that it was something that sparked a little dream or something in you too. Yeah, this kind of having fun, making music, and
Hmm.
all of a sudden you can apply that to all these different things. Uh yeah, fantastic, fantastic. I wanted to ask you, Ron, why after a successful career, a successful business book, nonfiction style. Why fiction? Why move into fiction in this sense? I always joke with people that do this when we have them on as, it's a terrible business model, writing fiction books. What made you want to take the turn into fiction and after this long, successful career and all of that?
Hmm. That's probably going back to what I said earlier, just raising your hand and try something different. But I can see doing, uh, I'm kind of early on in promoting this book, and I can see that it's a little more difficult uh, to promote a fiction book than it would be to do the business sales and marketing book that I did before. Uh, it's much easier to get booked on shows and podcasts for
Right.
that versus, talking about a science fiction book. Now, that being said, I've had already some pretty good initial interest in the new book to potentially have it be part of a TV show or series or a mini
Right.
thing through A24 or something, connected with Netflix. But yeah, it's just I've been working on this book on and off for 10 years. And I started working on it when I was on a project in Tokyo. And I was there for like 2.5 weeks and just started thinking, well, I got to do something with my time. So I started to do the draft of the chapters and the outline and all that. And I put it down for probably 2 or 3 years and then picked it up again about 3 years ago and started working on it. And that's when I just coincidentally, the person that helped me with my first book, who's an editor, talked to her about it, sent her the draft, and she was kind enough to uh, kind of help me with some ghostwriting and character development. And that's what I needed, that spark of somebody else looking at it from a different lens, a different view. Otherwise, it may have just stayed in the cobwebs and in the file cabinet.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to get to that too, kind of the launch, what you're seeing, how you've been, the steps you've taken in terms of, because we're the type of podcast where I always say it's anything goes. We've had, NBA winners, we've had people that are publishing their first self-published book. I mean, I like having that and hearing the stories. Our listeners are interested because I think there's so many different paths you can take now, especially when it comes to something like publishing with the internet and kind of empowering individual creators and things like that. It's just very fascinating to us. I do want to get to like how that's been going for you, but I have so many questions about just your life and work and fiction and literature in general. I wanted to ask you about murder mysteries.
Mhm.
It's in the book. What are your favorite murder mysteries, and even broader, what is it about murder mystery stories that grips you?
Yeah, probably early on, I liked Alfred Hitchcock, and I
Yeah.
really liked Rear Window and some of those types of things. And I liked Twilight Zone, and was a big fan of that. But well, like we talked about earlier, Robin Cook and Crichton, some of those writers really piqued my interest. Because when I was traveling, I was reading a lot of books on airplanes, and those were typically the type of books that I was into. And so that's where I thought, well, I'll give this a try, and I'll combine my medical background with a pretty, I think it's a pretty hot topic, sleep, and particularly dreaming is a big part of my new book. What do dreams mean, and why do we dream? And so a lot of that I learned through my work that I have done at Stanford with the Sleep Research Institute, and also in Kansas City when I lived there. So this new book takes place in Kansas City at a teaching hospital, and it also combines that with a research institute that does contract projects for the government and also for medical manufacturers and so on and so forth. So I kind of combine fact and fiction in the book. There's actually quite a bit in there, and the foreword was written by a friend of mine who's the director of the sleep center in Atlanta at Northside, and he's been a physician for many years. And I let him read the draft, and he was kind enough to write a foreword for the book. And he said, "This is really interesting. What you're portraying here in terms of the technology. And it's kind of like what if you could actually see people's dreams on a replayed video, so you can interpret them and see what they're dreaming about."
Yeah, that's interesting too. And then how we kind of, the misremembering from things and even just memory and dreams and the brain. I was just talking about this with another guest. We were talking about a classic novel, but it came up in terms of neuroscience. We really don't know a lot about the brain. It's the big mystery still in medicine and stuff. We don't know a lot of parts about it. We know the anatomy, we know a lot of stuff, but we don't know everything. And the mystery ones are the ones we don't, the things we don't know are the most interesting, like the ones that
Mhm.
we're most fascinated by, because, when you can look up the answer, it's, oh, okay, there's the answer. But when you don't know the answer, it's, well, what if it's this? What if it's this? And it's a theme on the podcast. We ask about like kind of, murder mystery pulp genres and stuff like that, where we're always fascinated by writers' takes and guest takes on this, the kind of what their thoughts are. I love pulp and crime fiction. And I always think of like, the heyday of that, where they had these guys cranking out these novels for like pennies a page,
Mhm.
and they're some of the best ever written. And there was the one guy who had the formula, right? Where he said, what do you do? So the first thing you do if you're writing a murder mystery, kill somebody in an unusual way.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Show the reader that. He's like,
Yeah.
and then there's this other stuff you have to, here's the hero, pile trouble on the hero. Okay. Get in a fight by the end of the third act, have the, have something go wrong. And it's just this whole formula he would use to crank out these novels. And it's just, there's something that I'm always titillated by, who am I thinking of? And then there were Agatha Christie. I'm thinking of Agatha Christie. I'm thinking of, the kind of drawing room murder mysteries that were big at turn of the century. Like there's always, even the biggest shows on TV are, a murder mystery, well, at least the network ones, murder mystery, NCIS, SVU, Law and Order, like these kind of, they're all murder mystery. They're little kind of vignettes, almost murder mystery story.
Mhm.
Usually it's variation, not always murder, but it's usually murder. And it just, when that happens, everything's escalated and the tension's high.
Mhm.
There's a mystery to solve, and it just, oof, so good. I mean, I'm a millennial, but obviously, I grew up watching Scooby Doo and things like that. It's one of my favorite shows still. And again, I'm very excited to show it to my daughter. She's still a little too young to, to comprehend that kind of stuff. But just even those, and some episodes are better than others, but I've seen every single one basically. And like the stuff from the 70s, like, all the way through till now. And it's just kind of, yeah, when they have a good story, even in a cartoon, a children's cartoon, it's like, oh, who's killing these people or who's disappearing these people? It just is so intriguing to me. And I don't know if that's personality or if it's just inherent to us. So I always like to ask writers that, especially ones that work in the craft of murder mysteries, what is it about that excites them? And I know this isn't a podcast where we're looking for definitive answers or, anything. We're just kind of, speculating about what we like about them and why it draws us in. So I'm always
Mhm.
curious. And going off of that, I wanted to ask you about science fiction in the same way. I'm thinking, yeah, Robin Cook, Michael Crichton, like we said, uh, and then for your book specifically, the sleep experiments, why is that ripe for fiction? Why is science fiction always so ripe for creativity and inventing new ideas? And I think for science fiction too, is like people, especially I came out of kind of the literary side of things, the academic side of things with literature and writing. And there's usually kind of a turn up your nose snob effect when you talk about science fiction. Kurt Vonnegut would talk about this in the 70s, kind of when he's talking to professors and stuff. They're like, oh, science fiction's, low grade, low brow kind of thing. But then you mentioned Philip K. Dick, you mentioned these other big iconic Asimov, these kind of people. you know, a lot of devices that we have, like even cell phones, like they were invented because somebody in the sci-fi realm created this fantasy thing, this fictional thing. And then we say, oh, that's really cool. Could we make that? You know, it really is a place for innovation, especially in technology. And you know, we don't have Star Trek, you know, beaming people through space, but you know, we don't have that idea until a creative writer sat down and thought it up, you know, like,
Hmm.
and then that idea is in the culture. Maybe it takes 100 years, 1,000 years, whatever it is. And then we start to develop these kind of communication devices and stuff. I don't know. So, your view on science fiction, why you love it so much, and why it works for you for writing, and why, you know, your specific topic of sleep experimentation works for it. I know that's a big question. Answer it however
Hmm.
you want.
No, I think that's interesting about Scooby-Doo, but I used to love the Jetsons. And I
Yes.
was thought, why can't we have cars that fly?
Right.
And it just is, I think someday we will see that as a reality, and it's got to start somewhere. But, over my career, I've been fortunate enough to work with the advanced development and research team for the military. And we brought up something about cell phones. And a
Right.
lot of the things we use today are things that were developed through the military, and it was based on a vision about, well, we there's a problem, and here's the solution, and we're going to create something called a cell phone, a satellite phone. And it's amazing how much technology has come from DARPA and through the research arm of the military that's now been commercialized through taxpayer dollars. But I've been involved in multi-million dollar projects with them, and one of them that was a big success was making a portable battery powered oxygen device that would replace oxygen tanks inside of rescue vehicles. And so we were given about $5 million to do the research and development for this project. Lo and behold, we needed another few million. We commercialized that. The military bought thousands of them, and it saved hundreds of military people's lives, because if a bullet goes through one of these vehicles, or a landmine or something explodes and the oxygen tank blows up or ruptures, it kills everybody inside the vehicle, because it becomes like a rocket inside
Right.
there. Well, our device, you could shoot it with a bullet, you could blow it up. It just stopped working.
Right.
And it's still, but when it's working, it's producing oxygen, and it's portable, runs on a battery, and it's life-saving sort of technology. So fast forward, that got commercialized, and now it's being used by people that carry around these little, battery powered oxygen concentrators. And so it's a benefit to the military, and it's a benefit to people in the public sector.
Yeah. That's interesting too. I was just listening to a podcast about Apple and China, and how Apple has been basically giving their IP to because they're developed, because they manufactured over there, you know, through kind of osmosis. And the author of the book was talking about how that has military implications. A lot of people don't think about the military implications, where a lot of these innovations start in the military or end up in the military, you know, if they
Mm-hmm.
didn't start there, because that is the biggest thing. And I always think, yeah, the flying cars. I like that. You know, I'm a fan of Peter Thiel and stuff, and he has that famous line. You know, we were promised flying cars, and all we got were 180 characters. You know, on Twitter or something. You know, like He's like, when I was growing up, everybody was promising, oh, we're gonna have flying cars and jetpacks, and we just don't. You know,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, but it starts in the fiction realm, and that's what I mean. Everybody kind of, especially in the academic side, they're like, oh, science fiction, it's lowbrow, but I'm like, but actually it's more culturally important than any of the literary stuff that's ever come out. Like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like in terms of the actual effect it has on the population and the technology and the warnings and all of that. I mean, you know, I always, you know, you mentioned Lord of the Rings in the beginning. More people have probably read Lord of the Rings and watched the movies than have ever read Hemingway or James Joyce or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
therefore it has more impact on culture than these literary things.
Or you
uh
look at, Dick Tracy. Who would have ever
yeah.
thought you could talk into your, like
Right.
Dick Tracy talking on his wristwatch, as a phone.
Right.
Now you go around and you see people do that all the time.
Exactly. I remember that first ad campaign for the Apple Watch. They had David Hasselhoff reprising that role where he had, what was that, Knight Rider or something,
Mhm.
with he had all the tech, the talking cars, the talking watches and stuff, James Bond spy stuff, like. And people forget too that, I mean, I have a James Bond series on this podcast where a friend of mine and we were reading all the James Bond books and talking about them in the movies. And people forget Fleming was a naval intelligence guy.
Right.
Over there, he knew the latest innovations
Mhm.
post World War II of the tech,
Mhm.
guns that they were trying to innovate, like the weapons, the things that were trying to be like spy style tech that was real. At least when he was writing about them, maybe he was exaggerating and adding creative flourishes, but it was real. He was sitting in these meetings, like looking at the schematics of they're trying to create a gun that makes less noise so they can assassinate people, or they're trying to make a poison or something that like
Mhm.
is in a pen like, that they give to somebody.
Or laser beams that could cut
Laser
you in half.
beam. The even I'm thinking the Israel Palestine with the IDF just did those beeper things, or whatever,
Mhm.
incredibly targeted. That would not have been possible without these kind of spy novels and things saying, oh, maybe we could do something that specific and that detailed.
The
That
Iron
takes,
Dome.
yeah, yeah. That's incredible technology. And people don't even, whatever, people have political opinions on it, but still. And this gets us to the research question, where you were talked about in other interviews and other places I'd seen the research that you had to do for this sort of book. And I wanted to ask, how do you approach the research aspect for this sort of book?
Or the science fiction book.
Yeah, science fiction book,
Yeah.
or your nonfiction book, or any of the stuff that you've done and your kind of research methods. Because I mean, because like you said, there's always overlap, in how
Mhm.
you're doing these.
Yeah, the nonfiction, the research I focused on, I did use quite a few sales and marketing books that I'd written, like good or have read, like Good to Great, which is the guy Collins, I think, wrote that many years ago. Um, and Malcolm Gladwell, people like that. I
Yeah,
read a lot of those books and applied some of their formulas to some of the things I'm talking about in my book. My book also consists of experts in certain fields that I interviewed, and then added my own thoughts into what they were putting into it, particularly like experts on patents. Was a
right.
patent attorney that did a lot of filings of patents, a lot of my patents. So he was kind enough to contribute a chapter to the book. Funding and financing was through a guy that I know that does venture capital and private equity funding. What are the most common ways to raise money for startups and projects like that? So that was the research, is finding the right people to interview and plugging them into the right chapters in the book. On the science fiction side, again, I took it in large part, I knew Kansas City, I knew the places to go, I knew the popular hangouts, and those are all mentioned throughout the book. Best places to play golf, sports teams, and things like that. The best, medical centers. And so incorporating fact and fiction in that book was kind of the pathway forward, at least for me on that one. And then the
Yeah,
research part of it that I did was really on the technology. How do you capture an image from a waveform that is an EEG waveform, and how would you visualize something like that? So you're in REM sleep, let's say, for instance, and that's when you're most actively dreaming, and you capture that montage of information, and then you translate that through uh, the software and the hardware that this guy's invented, and turn it into an actual image.
yeah. That's why Cook and Crichton were so good at that too, especially Cook. I think what he was kind of explaining. We've covered a Cook Chromosome 6 on this podcast, so we've covered one of his big novels. And this is the way he kind of breaks down, yeah, the actual scientific process, and it's even maybe it's even more detailed than most readers need, but it just kind of it gives you the visual, and that is a
Mhm.
skill. How do you translate this? And even in my work, like stuff that I do for my day job and stuff where most of what I do is breaking down complex things for people that don't understand it to be able to understand it. I taught college for about a decade and stuff, and that was what I did every day. You break down these things for people that don't know them so that they can understand it. It's just, that's a skill. That is something that you can develop through technique. You can reference these greats like Cook and stuff, go back, how did they do it? So I always fascinated writers' processes for doing
Mhm.
that. How you
Mhm.
how you manage to do that is always interesting. uh And moving right along here, publishing. I want to get to publishing. Why self-publish, especially given your credentials, your career. Why self-publish, especially the first nonfiction book? Why did you choose to go this route?
Yeah, I have two or three friends that have published a number of books, and some of them have gone through publishing companies,
Right.
but that was years ago when they
Right.
actually got upfront fees and they
Right.
were, sponsored essentially to take a book and get it to market. I think that's changed quite a
Oh
bit.
yes. Oh
And
yes.
so self-publishing is kind of the route that a lot of people are taking anymore, unless you're a big name person that can get $1 million, contract to get a
Right.
book out. And so, and it's not as hard to do as it was
Right.
before. I kind of compare it to the music industry. Back when I was writing and doing recordings, the studios were very brick and mortar based, very professional, very complex. And you have engineers specifically doing certain jobs for mixing, mastering, and all that kind of stuff. And the studio time is expensive. Fast forward, my last record that I did it in a house, same type of equipment, but much more streamlined. And now you even fast forward that, and you've got people doing pretty good recordings at home using Pro Tools and different things. And then they're going through a self-publishing route even with their music. So in the music industry, there's a lot of shortcuts, and you can use social media, TikTok, or whatever to get your songs out there. But it's a lot easier and faster for musicians now to put an EP out than it was 10 years ago. It's a lot less expensive. You apply that then to self-publishing for books. You use companies like Boker, you use KDP. There's a lot of good vehicles out there that are pretty turnkey. And KDP is the one that I used in Boker, by the way, to get my book out. And then you've got your ISBN, codes and all the stuff you have to apply to that, the barcoding and whatnot. And then you get it put on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and off you go and start promoting it through social media or whatever. But I think that's where I still need help, is figuring out the puzzle, the missing pieces of the puzzle, connecting my book with the reader or the audience out there that would be specifically wanting to engage and take time to read a science fiction murder mystery like I just wrote. So I'm
Yeah.
still searching for a contact for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We had an independent musician on, and they were talking about the same things, where they said these big companies, what they had that you couldn't get, that you still can't get on your own, is distribution. That's what they had. Same with the
Mhm.
big publishers, the big five at least. You can always do indie level and stuff and whatever, but they have distribution kind of monopolies is why, you
Mhm.
want those contracts. It used to be that you got, yeah, like an upfront money or something. We've had people on that, yeah, got, book deals with a big five, and there's no upfront money anymore. Yeah, like
Yeah.
it is not happening. Uh, but you're stuck with distribution. You have to do that on your own, and it is easier. Yeah, there are other pathways, but it is, it's tough. And there's all these things out there. There's all these publicists that will tell you they'll do this, but then are they actually doing it? Yeah, so we're always fascinated about this on this podcast, and how authors choose to go about it and stuff. We had a doctor on that was a pediatric sleep medicine expert, was her thing. She did the same thing. She self-published her book, and I was just asking her, I was like, your reputation, your credentials, you could probably have easily pitched this to a big five or something. And yeah, you don't get a huge amount of money or anything, but you get the distribution and stuff. So I'm always curious. And she said something similar. Said she chose to go this route because it was a little less complicated. It was a little bit, you could test the waters a little bit easier and like make some mistakes without having it be catastrophic. And then she said, it's actually been going okay, and she hired people, editors and publicists and stuff. And she did it that way, basically doing it all herself though. And I'm just fascinated. I'm like, you see, even somebody who would normally have no problem getting a contract for that to be put out and distributed is reconsidering, and somebody like you in that position too, where you looked at your options and you said, maybe my best option is to just do this. I feel like that's something, that we're living through a moment. I had another writer on that was self-published, and he had spelled out his plan. He has a 5-10 year plan to get readers, where he said, I know it's not going to happen in the first 5 years. I have to keep putting out books. And I think maybe by year 10, people will start to know, oh, this guy writes these books.
Mhm.
It's just interesting how everybody has these methods, and it is kind of a, free for all in terms of all these options are open to you. So I wanted to ask, why did you choose to go with Amazon specifically? Why not, the Barnes and Noble version? Or I know there's other versions of this
Mhm.
style, the KDP style. Why did you choose to go with Amazon?
I guess because I had pretty good success with them with the first book,
Right.
and maybe it was just luck or whatever, but um, it just seemed of all the things that I had looked at in terms of options, Barnes and Noble and Amazon were the two best routes for me. Now, this last book, I've been talking to a friend of mine who's in the movie industry, and I got him a copy of the book, and we talked about another option. He goes, you really need to look at finding a database of small privately owned bookstores that are
Right.
boutique like, and they would probably buy some of your books and put them on the shelf. And he said the other thing I'd suggest is if you see book fairs where you can set up a table and do a book signing or whatever, those are always another option where people, both publicists and smaller book companies are looking for material like this.
Yeah. Yeah, we had another she was doing children's books, another self-published writer, and she said she had actually had more sales doing that, the book fairs, and then driving in kind of a 50-mile radius from her house, the local libraries, local bookstores, and
Mhm.
basically pitching to them, with books out of her trunk, and
Yeah.
and she said she's had more sales doing that than she has with the Amazon and stuff like that, which I wanted to ask you about too. Like, have you used ads in this kind of camp book launch campaign at all for either of these books, and how did that
Mhm.
go?
Not yet.
Not yet.
That's something that I'm exploring. And I'm also thinking about hiring a publicist to, help me with some of the marketing and sales aspects of it. Because I really don't know that world that well. I'm more akin to the medical, side of things.
Right.
But the same thing applies to, medical devices. When I start doing work with startups, I tell them, and I keep telling them over and over and over again, you can have the best idea, but if nobody knows about it, you're never going to sell any. So
Right.
distribution is critical, that you start to really think early on, how am I going to get this into the hospital, or how am I going to get this into the home care environment or long-term care, wherever you're going to sell it. And you've got to have a connection with either stocking distributors or a manufacturer you can license to. But that's the end all be all, is, how are you going to get to market?
Yeah, that's interesting too, because we've had a few authors on that were even people that I have a friend that I went to grad school with, where she got a deal with a big five press and her first novel, and she was still doing it herself. They weren't giving her money for marketing and stuff. I think they were doing some placement and some distribution that you wouldn't get unless you went through these big presses, but they weren't really doing marketing. She was setting up the events herself. She was doing the podcasting herself, scheduling these types of things. And it's just interesting how that's changing now. I think we're living through a moment where nobody knows how to sell these things or market them, or at least the old ways aren't working anymore. So like the new ways are still kind of being developed, and they're being developed by, people like you publishing individually, and then they're being developed by small presses, and they're even the big presses are trying to develop new ways to do this, and they're kind of chasing TikTok and stuff like that right now. But I've heard mixed things. This is the only reason I asked, is because I've heard mixed things about some using Amazon ads or Meta ads, or some of these big tech company ads. I've heard mixed things. I've heard great success. I've heard that they'll happily take your money and not not lead to anything.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, we're always just curious about that there, how it's working and how each author is choosing to go about it for that.
Mhm.
These last couple of questions are all kind of writing craft specific, Ron, where we like to know kind of the details about the practice, the craft of writing. We like to know, what is your writing routine like? How do you like to do this? Are you a morning writer, night writer? What do you like to do for your writing routines?
I kind of like late morning, early afternoon for me, and try to have a routine that forces me to at least try to write for at least 30 minutes to an hour.
Right.
Not grind it out or anything. It's got to be fun, and it's got to be something that you look forward to doing. And when it starts to just become mundane and just, this is just too hard, I just tell people, and I tell myself this, to back off for a while, just
Right.
take a break, take a breather. It's like working out at the gym. You can't, if you don't feel up to it that day, just take a day off and then try to go back the next day.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you like to do daily stuff, or like you said, just kind of feel it out? Any crazy rituals or anything that you do to get into the mindset? Or
It's easier, I find, if you get, it's kind of like the theory, like Pareto's theory, 80-20, the 80-20 rule.
yes,
Once
yeah,
once you get inertia and you kind of get that, the juice is flowing, then it takes off, and it's easier for me. But sometimes just getting that 20% of inertia to get, some momentum and energy into the project takes an inordinate amount of time and thought process applied to it. So, I like it when it's easy. It's like in the product development world for medical stuff, I love the innovation. I love the marketing part of it. I love the working through the patent process and all that, and the creativity that goes with it. But for writing a book, yeah, it takes patience, it takes determination, it takes a whole combination of, using both sides of your brain, really.
yeah. Yeah, we always like to ask you. We have some people that will detail these elaborate rituals or something to get them in the mindset, and then the other people are just a cup of coffee first thing in the morning, before the kids wake up or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always interesting how everybody has their own way of getting into that, because it's important. Those are not minor things; those are major things.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to get yourself into that mindset, that's a huge, huge deal.
Yeah, for playing live shows, I definitely have a routine I go through before I play. I have
What,
to, it almost like it's like a ritual, just to keep me centered and keep me calm and focused, just to get off to the right start with the first couple songs.
yeah. Yeah. Anything you do in particular? I know that the musicians have always had kind of some elaborate routines, and others just go out there, whatever, take a swig of beer and go out there, sure. But like, others have elaborate. I know I'm a big Red Hot Chili Peppers fan. I know like a lot of them, especially since they're all off drugs now, like they say that they're, they do a lot of stretching and like drink tea and kind of like warm
Mhm.
ups, vocal and finger warm ups, kind of. That's how they prepare now, in their 40s and 50s for a show, like to do some, perform for hours live. I mean, that's people don't understand how difficult that is too,
Yeah.
mentally, physically. That takes a toll. So yeah, having a ritual really helps. Same thing for writing. Same thing for entrepreneurship. I think a lot of this too. You have
Hmm.
to kind of have a ritual where you're doing a little bit every day.
Hmm.
Very interesting. Another thing I like to ask here, Ron, is how do you make a living? And we don't need to get into any numbers or anything like that, but do you make any money off of the books? Because we asked this for a couple of reasons, but the main one is, it's tough out there for writers, and everyone's wanting to know, how do you make a living as a writer? Turns out most people don't, right? So we just like
Hmm.
to ask, how do you make a living? You have your consulting day job, right? That you usually, and then,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, and I'd say majority of my income comes from my medical consulting business.
right,
It's just like, I'll just tell you honestly, I've been in the music industry for a long time, and only 5% of the musicians that I know actually make enough money to where that's their only job. Most of
right,
the people I play with and work with in the music industry have one or two other jobs. Uh, I I don't know a lot of writers, but I'd probably say the same formula applies, that they probably, 5% of them make a living off of enough of living off of their books and
right.
doing talks and things like that, that they don't need to work somewhere else. They can just dedicate full time to writing, but that's few and far between.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why we asked the question too, because I think that's the reality of it. You know, like I said, we've had National Book Award winners on this podcast, and they say the exact same thing. They're just like, I
Hmm.
have to teach for a living, I have to run workshops. Like, even if you get a little check, it's not actually enough to live off of. 20 grand. Yeah, it's great to get a check for that, but realistically, can you live off of that? Like, no.
No.
Are you getting that every year? No, you're not getting that check every year.
Yeah,
It's
so you definitely have to have, a backup income,
yeah, yeah.
and do this. It's funny when I talked with a doctor a couple of months ago that he had an idea for a new anesthesia product, and he had developed some prototypes. He'd self-funded, and then as we start talking through this, I realize this guy's working full time at a
Right.
hospital. And I asked him the question, I go, how are you going to be able to afford to keep developing this project? And he goes, I'm a big believer in this, and I'll work weekends, I'll work nights, I'll do whatever it takes. But I said, that's a great spirit to have about this, but the reality of it is, you're on call, you've got a
Right.
lot of responsibilities, you can't get too tired or fatigued. You got to be, up and at 'em for your job. And I just said, you might want to consider bringing on some consulting help, with the product development at this stage. So you have to
Right.
figure out, how you're going to juggle all the plates.
Man's got to know his limitations, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what my father always said, that we big Dirty Harry fan, so he would always he would always give me like Clint Eastwood quotes, stuff like that. Is like, he said he would tell when he was training younger doctors, he said he would tell them that too. He'd be like, you got to ask yourself, is like, do you know your limitations right now? Do you feel lucky?
Hmm.
Like you're about to just cut somebody open here.
Yeah. No.
How are you going to go into this?
Yeah. They work long, hard hours. My wife's a doctor, and I'll tell you what, I have a lot of respect for her and all the doctors that do what they do.
Right. Yeah. That's yeah, yeah, absolutely. People get focused on the pay or whatever that you get for that, but it's like, all right, you want to go work 80-hour weeks? Like most people don't want to work those, be on call during every
Right.
holiday, on
Yeah,
every weekend.
exactly.
Somebody calling you have to stop what you're doing at your kid's soccer game and take the call because it's you that are on call this day, not
Mm,
all the other people.
exactly.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, you saw it firsthand when growing up.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You can see every side of it. You can see the stages of the career too. Is when you're starting out in that career, obviously it's much more work for less pay, and then as you get more advanced in the thing, then you get kind of rewarded later on. Maybe like entrepreneurship, like writing fiction. Like you kind of
Hmm.
get rewarded later on if you keep doing it. Um, Another thing we like to ask everybody that comes on here, are you reading anything good, watching anything good, listening to anything good? What's filling your head and inspiring you right now? And this could be anything from classic literature to, reality TV or whatever, your favorite albums or anything like that. What are you filling your head with right now? What are you enjoying?
I'm
Books,
enjoying
movies?
listening to Revolver by the
Oh,
Beatles,
yes.
and I pulled that out, and then I've been listening a lot to Paul Simon, Graceland,
Okay.
and really enjoying that. I've kind of rekindled my interest in vinyl, so I've been buying a lot of records and enjoying the vinyl scene again. And then in terms of reading, I just finished a book that a guy wrote about smallpox and the evolution of vaccines, and it coincides somewhat with the recent COVID things that
Right.
we went through. But
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I've been hearing about it on like
yeah, it's called Pox, the
okay,
name of
yeah,
the
yeah,
book.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And so that's been really enlightening to read some historical thing that was written about the Spanish flu,
Right.
and how people were resistant to vaccines back then, and then polio, and all these epidemics that occurred over time, and all the problems uh, we had getting vaccines approved or getting them on the market or marketing them to the public to convince them that they should take it. And then fast forward to where we went with COVID.
Yeah. This makes me feel like I got to pull out the famous James Baldwin quote. You think your pain is totally unique and then you read and you realize that it's actually been going on for thousands of years. Like, and you're feeling the
Exactly.
same things and having the same problems that every human being has had before you.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're getting people to take this or to uptake a vaccine or something. It's the same problem they've been having 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's
Exactly.
never going away. It expands your mind to read this stuff. Yeah. And the final question we like to ask every writer that comes on here, Ron, what are you working on now? What's taking up your time creatively? What's taking up your energy and your time?
Right now, I'm working on a remote monitoring telehealth telemedicine platform that we monitor. It's mostly transportation, so it's truck drivers, long haul truckers that have sleep disorders and fatigue. And so we've developed a remote monitoring platform that can monitor thousands of drivers across the United States using wearables, things like rings, watches, whatever. And if they're on CPAP, we can monitor their CPAP machines through a telehealth mobile monitoring system.
Very fascinating. That is for, I guess, the kind of problem that you see long haul drivers have in terms of sleep. Maybe they take too many amphetamines or something, and that affects it too, or like coffee, even caffeine.
Yeah, it's a tough lifestyle.
Yeah,
It's a hard job, physically, mentally demanding, and a lot of these truck drivers they work really long hours, and but they're not in very good health. The general statistic is that truck drivers uh, live about 10 years less than the normal uh, population of both male and female.
I know they're more prone to stuff like blood clots and things as well, right? Because of the
Hmm.
just sitting in that position 18 hours a
Yeah.
day or something. And
So yeah, our fatigue management program is really working well, and it's helping to reduce accidents, and it's also helping to reduce companies' overall insurance issues.
yeah, it's fascinating, fascinating. And that's just like, is this like beta testing level basically, or even earlier than that?
No, no, it's a mature platform.
Okay.
I've been working on it on and off for about 5 years.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. 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 Ron, this has been absolutely great. Been a pleasure to talk to you.
You
Where
too.
can people find you? Give social media handles, website, platforms, anything. And this is all linked below as well.
Yeah. So my website's inventingstartstoday.com, and that's where my books and there's a contact page on there too. You can schedule appointments with me. And I'm not real big on social media. I don't really use Facebook that much or Instagram or any of that kind of stuff. I just try to stay off my computer
I say that those
as much as I
publicists will be
can.
on you for that. Yeah, they'll be like, you gotta have it. I think even Cormac McCarthy, before he died, his publicist forced him to get accounts for all
True,
this.
true, very
I
true.
think even his first post or something was, I'm not, my publicist made me do this. I don't care. you know,
Yeah, and I'm probably guilty of not being a very good social media person.
it's all changed. It's all changed too. It's even a couple years ago, it was all you could make a post and go viral and it would be great. Companies kind of realize that's their most valuable asset is the people seeing your stuff, the viral moment. So now it's all pay to play. You got to pay for that now. You got
Hmm.
to pay to get that kind of exposure. So they're charging to do that. Like even when I post stuff about podcasts and stuff like this, and I'm promoting our episodes like this, and I'll put up the promo, the links to all the social media sites, there's always this little button at the bottom. It was like, would you like to promote this? And so you send it to 100,000 people. And I'm like, oh, what does that cost? It's like, used to cost maybe $50, $100, up to 150, 300 now, easy to do that. I'm like,
Hmm.
I don't know. We can't really afford that for every episode here, but
Yeah. Well, like chat
it's
chat
tough.
GPT, it used to
Yeah.
be free and now it's $29 a month. So
Oh,
it's
yes.
nothing's free anymore. It's the whole world's monetized on SaaS platforms and
Yes.
subscription based things.
So I live in Vegas too, and that's what a lot of the locals here we complain about. They took away the free parking in the garages. They took away that just a couple of years ago, and everybody was like, "What?" So now less locals are going to go to the malls and the things like that, and the restaurants because now you got to pay $40 to just sit in the put your car in the garage for a couple hours.
It's terrible.
So they try to do some stuff. So some of them offer, like, if you're local and you scan your driver's license at the pay kiosk, if it's like under 2 or 3 hours, they'll let locals have free parking. But
Hmm.
like only a few of them do that. And,
Mhm.
most of them are like, no, pay us 25, $40 to park here. It's like, okay, just to step foot inside, unless
Mhm.
you're, staying at the hotel or something. But, if you're
Yeah.
local, it's incredible. It's crazy. Not to go off on this tangent. I know we're bumping up against time here, Ron. Again, thank you again. This has been fantastic.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Yeah, please come back. Please come back anytime. The next book or anything, you have something coming out, please. We love to have writers on here, and we love to help them out and promote as much as we can.
Really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored. I may say the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored,
Some activities are intentional, right?
it shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I
Heavy.
should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.